Big Shaq arrives at the airport, ready to board his own private jet, but a cocky TSA agent stops him, refusing to believe he belongs there. Tension builds as security escalates. Passengers watch in silence, and the situation spirals into a high-stakes power struggle. But just when it seems like Shaq is outnumbered, a single phone call changes everything. The airport staff pales as black SUVs pull up, carrying top executives, federal officials, and a truth no one saw coming. Who really holds the power? And when the dust settles, will his enemy face ruin or redemption? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The black SUV rolled to a smooth stop at the private terminal of JFK International Airport, its tinted windows reflecting the warm glow of the runway lights. The moment the rear door opened, the air shifted. Big Shaq stepped out, towering, composed, and unmistakably in command. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad frame perfectly, he exuded quiet power. His polished shoes hit the pavement with measured steps, and without hesitation, he walked toward the private security checkpoint designated for VIP flyers. Inside the terminal, the ambiance was starkly different from the chaotic main airport. Everything was pristine. Sleek marble floors, minimalist leather seating, the faint aroma of fresh espresso drifting from the lounge. A handful of well-dressed passengers sipped champagne, waiting for their private flights. Shaq had done this countless times before. It was routine. Until today. "Excuse me, sir." The voice cut through the low murmur of the lounge. Shaq barely turned his head as a TSA agent stepped into his path. Agent Brad Keller, mid-40s, sharp jawline, buzzed blonde hair, and a rigid stance that screamed authority. But there was something else in his eyes, something more than just protocol. He wasn't just stopping Shaq. He was challenging him. "Yeah?" Shaq responded, his voice calm, unreadable. Keller crossed his arms. "What's your business here?" Shaq lifted an eyebrow, more amused than surprised. "I'm flying out." Keller's eyes flicked over Shaq's suit, then down to his size, his sheer presence. A slow smirk curled onto the agent's face, the kind that came with quiet assumptions. "This is a private terminal. You sure you're in the right place?" Keller asked, tilting his head slightly. Shaq exhaled through his nose. He'd been here before. Not here exactly, but this moment. The pause before a power struggle. The unspoken doubt in someone's eyes when they saw him somewhere they didn't think he belonged. "I'm sure," Shaq said simply. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his ID and flight confirmation, holding them out with an easy patience. Keller didn't even glance at them. He let the silence stretch. Then, without moving, he let out a short, disbelieving chuckle. "These real?" he asked, nodding toward the documents but making no effort to take them. Shaq's jaw tightened. A fraction. Barely noticeable, but it was there. "You want to check them or keep talking?" Keller finally took the documents, flipping the ID between his fingers, scanning the boarding pass like he was looking for a flaw. His smirk didn't fade. "You're telling me you own a private jet?" Keller asked, loud enough for a few nearby passengers to glance over. Shaq kept his composure. "That's what the papers say." Keller let out a scoff. "Uh-huh. And where exactly are you headed, Mr. Lawson?" Shaq kept his eyes steady. "Does it matter?" Keller tilted his head, clearly enjoying this. "Just doing my job." Shaq folded his arms. "Your job includes profiling?" A brief flicker of something crossed Keller's face. Annoyance, maybe, or the thrill of a challenge. He looked Shaq up and down again, then turned slightly, motioning toward another agent across the room. A second TSA officer approached, younger, less sure of himself. He glanced at Shaq, then back at Keller. "What's the issue?" the younger agent asked. Keller didn't break eye contact with Shaq. "Run his name." A small ripple of tension passed through the room. The lounge grew quieter. A businessman in the corner sipped his drink slower. A woman scrolling her phone glanced up, sensing the shift. Shaq took a slow breath. "You're making a mistake." Keller smirked. "That's so?" The younger agent hesitated. "Sir, his documents seem fine." Just run the name, Keller snapped. Shaq exhaled sharply, glancing toward the terminal's large windows where his own jet sat waiting. This was ridiculous. A security officer moved toward a desk, typing Shaq's name into a system. A tense moment passed. The younger agent's brows furrowed as he read the screen. Sir," he murmured to Keller. "It says he's cleared." Keller didn't react, didn't budge, didn't want to accept it. "Check again," Keller said, his voice sharper. Shaq shifted, rolling his shoulders, the first sign of irritation surfacing. "You done yet?" Keller held his ground. "You're not boarding yet." A murmur rippled through the waiting area. A man in a dark suit whispered something to his wife. Another passenger, clearly uncomfortable, shifted in his chair. They could feel it now. This wasn't just a security check. This was something else. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. One of his pilots, probably wondering about the delay. He ignored it and looked back at Keller. "You're wasting my time." Keller stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Shaq could hear. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but money doesn't buy you a free pass. Not here." Shaq's patience wore thinner. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough. "And what exactly do you think I am?" Keller's smirk returned. "That's what we're figuring out." The weight of the moment thickened. This was no longer about a boarding pass. This was about power. About a man like Keller trying to remind someone like Shaq that he could still be held up, still be doubted, still be treated like he didn't belong. A voice interrupted. "Excuse me." Both men turned. A woman, mid-30s, sharp blazer, camera tucked into her purse, stood nearby. Victoria Hayes, a journalist, and one who had just pulled out her phone, holding it just low enough to look casual, but not low enough to hide that she was recording. "I'm sorry, but is there an issue here?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. Keller hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered. Shaq saw it. He knew what was happening now. The dynamic was shifting. The moment Keller realized he wasn't just dealing with one man, he was dealing with a story. Another buzz in Shaq's pocket. He ignored it. His voice when he spoke was steady, certain. "You want to keep playing this game, Keller?" Keller clenched his jaw. Victoria took a small step closer, tilting her head. "Or should I ask the airport manager to come over?" Shaq didn't break eye contact with Keller, neither did Victoria, and just like that, the standoff shifted. The game had changed, and Keller knew it. A heavy silence settled over the private terminal. The soft murmur of conversation among the VIP travelers had faded, replaced by the unmistakable weight of tension. All eyes were on Shaq and Keller. The power struggle was no longer just between them. It was a performance. One man desperately clinging to his authority, the other refusing to break under it. Shaq could feel the unease in the room. Wealthy businessmen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A couple exchanging hushed words avoided making eye contact with either of them. Even the airport staff behind the security desks seemed hesitant, their hands pausing over keyboards as if waiting to see how this would unfold. But Keller didn't waver. If anything, the silent audience seemed to fuel him. "Look," Keller said, folding his arms, voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know who you think you are, but if you can't prove you have the right to be here, we have a problem." Shaq didn't blink. "You've got my ID and my flight papers," he said smoothly. "That's all the proof you need." Keller scoffed. "Right, because I'm just supposed to take your word for it?" He looked over his shoulder at the younger TSA agent, who still seemed hesitant. "Did his credentials check out?" The agent nodded. "Yes, sir. His name is on the flight manifest, and—" Keller cut him off. "Run them again." Shaq exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thinner. "You already checked them, twice. So what exactly are you looking for?" Keller smirked. "Just being thorough." The words were deliberate, a challenge. Shaq knew exactly what was happening. Keller wasn't looking for a reason to clear him. He was looking for a reason to stall. The air in the terminal grew heavier. Shaq could feel it, the moment where things could spiral out of control. He could push back, demand to speak to someone higher up. But that's what Keller wanted. The second Shaq lost his temper, he'd be painted as the aggressor. So instead, he remained perfectly still. "Take your time," Shaq said, voice cool. "I'm not going anywhere." Keller's smirk faltered just a fraction. He hadn't expected that. The waiting game had begun. Just when the moment stretched long enough to become unbearable, a new figure entered the scene. Daniel Langley, the airport manager. Late 50s, well-groomed, gray suit tailored to perfection. He walked with the air of a man who considered himself important. "Mr. Keller," Langley said briskly, adjusting his tie as he approached. "What seems to be the issue?" Keller's smirk returned. "This gentleman is trying to board a private jet without proper verification." Langley's gaze flickered to Shaq. "Is that so?" Shaq studied Langley's face carefully. There was something off about his expression. It wasn't curiosity. It was a decision already made. Langley wasn't here to help. He was here to support Keller. Shaq kept his tone even. "My paperwork is in order. The TSA has checked it multiple times. There's no issue here." Langley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you understand, Mr. Lawson. We have procedures to follow. Some individuals might attempt to gain access to private flights under false pretenses." Shaq's jaw tightened. There it was. Some individuals. The words were carefully chosen. Not outright discriminatory, but the message was clear enough. "I own the jet," Shaq said. Langley raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here we are." Shaq didn't flinch. "Here we are." Keller crossed his arms, now emboldened. "So, unless you've got someone who can vouch for you, I think we're done here." Shaq held his ground, but in the corner of his vision, he noticed something. A woman standing near the check-in counter. She wasn't watching like the other passengers. She was studying. A flight attendant. Early 40s, sharp eyes, auburn hair neatly pulled into a bun. Her Eversky Airlines uniform crisp and perfectly in place. And she looked like she recognized him. Shaq made a note of her, but before he could act, Keller spoke again. "Escort him out." The words landed like a hammer. For the first time, a ripple of shock passed through the room. Even the VIPs who had been carefully pretending not to pay attention suddenly looked up. Shaq narrowed his eyes. "You sure you want to do that?" Keller smiled. "I'm sure." The younger TSA agent hesitated. "Sir, maybe we should—" Keller shot him a sharp look. "I said escort him out." Shaq didn't move. His entire posture was unreadable. "Unless," Keller added smugly, "you'd rather make a scene." The challenge hung in the air. Shaq met Keller's gaze, holding it. The unspoken power struggle reached its peak. Would he argue? Comply? Or do something Keller didn't see coming? The woman near the counter took a small step forward, and that's when Shaq made his move. He reached into his pocket, not aggressively, not in a way that would give Keller an excuse to escalate, but with a slow, deliberate motion. Keller tensed, expecting resistance. Instead, Shaq pulled out his phone, dialed a number, put it on speaker. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then, a deep, authoritative voice answered. "This is Director Reynolds." Keller's smirk disappeared. The airport manager blanched. Passengers murmured, sensing something shift in the air. Shaq's voice was calm. "We have a situation at JFK. One of your TSA agents seems to think he can override federal aviation laws." Silence. Then Reynolds' voice, clipped and professional. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Shaq ended the call. The room held its breath. Keller's confidence evaporated like mist under the heat of scrutiny. For the first time, he looked unsure. Shaq slid his phone back into his pocket. He didn't need to say another word. Because in 5 minutes, everything was about to change. The moment hung in the air. Shaq could feel it. The shift in the room. Keller had played his hand, calling for security to escort him out, expecting him to either lash out or back down. But Shaq did neither. He simply stood there, composed, unmoving. 2 uniformed security officers approached, their expressions uncertain. Even they could tell that something wasn't right. They weren't dealing with some random passenger trying to sneak into a restricted area. Shaq wasn't acting guilty. He was acting like a man who knew exactly how this would end. But before they could grab his arm, "Excuse me." A voice cut through the tension. The kind of voice that commanded attention. A woman stepped forward from the VIP lounge, walking toward them with purpose. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her crisp navy blue blazer moving smoothly as she advanced. Victoria Hayes. Sharp. Calculated. Known for exposing corporate scandals and power abuses. And the moment Shaq saw her, he knew Keller was about to have a very bad day. She held up her phone, already recording. What exactly is happening here? The entire room froze. The VIP passengers, who had been quietly pretending not to watch, fully turned toward the scene. Keller blinked, caught off guard, before quickly trying to regain control. "Ma'am, this is a private security matter," Keller said, his voice tight. "I suggest you step back." Victoria didn't move. "A private security matter?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Because from what I see, you're stopping a man who has valid documents from boarding his own jet." A heavy pause. Keller's smirk wavered. Shaq said nothing. He didn't need to. Victoria tilted her phone slightly, making sure the recording captured Keller's face. "So," she continued, her voice calm but sharp, "is there a reason why Mr. Shaq is being detained? Or should I assume this is just an attempt to exercise power where it isn't needed?" Keller stiffened. "This is a routine check." Victoria's expression didn't change. "Right, routine." She let the word sit, then turned the camera slightly toward Shaq. "Mr. Lawson, do you feel like this is routine?" Shaq met her gaze. Then, for the first time since this started, he smiled. "Nope." A quiet ripple of amusement passed through the crowd. Keller's fingers clenched around Shaq's documents. He was losing control, and he knew it. "This woman is interfering with a federal security matter," Keller snapped, pointing at Victoria. Victoria laughed softly. "Oh, now it's a federal matter? That's funny." Her phone camera shifted, panning across the lounge. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like racial profiling disguised as security." A collective murmur spread. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded slightly, as if seeing the situation clearly for the first time. Then, the moment Keller truly lost control. One by one, people pulled out their phones. It started small. A businessman adjusting his cufflinks while casually angling his camera. A woman pretending to check messages, but her lens clearly focused on the unfolding drama. Within seconds, half a dozen phones were recording. Shaq watched as the realization hit Keller. The power had shifted. The TSA agent wasn't in control anymore. The internet was. Keller's voice dropped a notch, trying to contain the situation. "You all need to put those away. Now." No one moved. Victoria gave a small, knowing smirk. "I'd choose your next move carefully, Agent Keller." The words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. For the first time, Keller hesitated. His stance, once confident, now wavered. He could feel the eyes on him. The phones capturing every second. Shaq let the moment stretch. Then, he pulled out his own phone and dialed a number, put it on speaker. Keller's brows furrowed. "Who are you calling?" Shaq didn't answer. The line rang once, twice. Then, a deep, authoritative voice came through. "This is Director Reynolds." The moment the name dropped, the entire room shifted. Keller's face turned pale. Even Victoria raised an eyebrow. Because Director Reynolds wasn't just anyone. He was the head of Federal Aviation Authority, a man who didn't take unnecessary calls. And yet, he had answered Shaq's on the first ring. Keller inhaled sharply. "What?" Shaq spoke, his voice low and even. "Hey, Reynolds, we got a situation at JFK. Your guys might want to look into it." A pause. Then, Reynolds' voice came back, clipped and sharp. "Understood. Give me 2 minutes." Shaq ended the call. Silence. Then, 2 words that shattered Keller's last grip on control. "You're done." Keller's breathing turned shallow. He had lost. And everyone in that room knew it. For the first time, Shaq leaned in, speaking only to him. "I told you, Keller, you were making a mistake." And this time, Keller believed him. The weight of silence hung over the terminal like a thick fog. Keller was frozen, his face pale, his fingers still clenched around Shaq's flight documents as if holding on to them could somehow salvage his authority. But the reality had already slipped away. Shaq had made one call. And now? The consequences were pulling up outside. A deep, distant hum filled the air. Engines, not one, multiple. Outside the terminal's glass doors, a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled in, their dark-tinted windows gleaming under the airport lights. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring. Even the TSA officers glanced at each other, uncertain. Keller's breath quickened. His eyes darted toward Langley, the airport manager, looking for direction. But Langley's face had lost its color, because Langley knew. This wasn't routine. A second later, the car doors opened, and Power stepped out. A man in a dark navy suit emerged first, stepping out with the quiet authority of someone used to being in control of entire industries. Charles Davenport, Chief Executive Officer of Eversky Airlines. A name Keller knew. A name Langley definitely knew. Behind him, more figures followed. Top lawyers in tailored suits, federal officials with polished lapel pins, and a few serious-looking men who weren't carrying badges, but radiated the kind of presence that made it clear they didn't need them. One of them, a tall, silver-haired man with steely gray eyes, strode forward, his expression unreadable. Director Reynolds. The very man Keller had heard on the other end of Shaq's phone minutes ago. Keller's throat went dry. This was no ordinary response. This was a reckoning. The moment the tables turn. As the officials stepped inside, the entire terminal seemed to shrink. The air shifted. Keller and Langley, once the ones controlling the situation, now looked like cornered prey. The first words came not from Shaq, but from Reynolds. He didn't even acknowledge Keller at first. He simply walked up to Shaq. And then, in a tone that left no room for interpretation, he said, "Sir, are you all right?" Keller's entire body locked up. Langley's lips parted slightly, his breathing shallow. Because that one word, "sir," told them everything. Shaq hadn't just called someone who could help. He had called someone who answered to him. Reynolds turned, his gaze finally landing on Keller. "I received an urgent call about a potential violation of FAA protocol," Reynolds said, his voice clipped, professional. "Would you care to explain what the hell is going on here?" Keller opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, words failed him. Langley stepped forward instead, forcing a thin smile. "Director Reynolds, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply conducting—" Davenport, the CEO of Eversky Airlines, suddenly spoke. "Langley," he said, his tone calm, but sharp as a blade. Langley turned to him, still attempting damage control. "Mr. Davenport, Davenport cut him off. "I know exactly what happened here." Langley froze. Keller felt his pulse hammering. Davenport's expression remained impassive. "I just spoke with my board," he continued, adjusting his cufflinks. "And do you know what they told me?" Langley swallowed. "Sir, they told me that one of my largest shareholders, who also happens to be my most trusted partner, was detained at his own terminal." Langley's face fell completely. Keller's knees felt weak. Because there it was. The truth. Shaquille Big Shaq wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just a VIP. He owned Eversky Airlines. Keller's chest tightened as the realization sank in. Shaq didn't just have power. He was the power. Everything Keller had done, the profiling, the humiliation, the power trip, had been against a man who could end his entire career with a single word. Langley was the first to attempt an apology. "Mr. Lawson, please understand." Shaq finally spoke, and his words were calm, dangerous, final. "Save it." Langley shut his mouth instantly. Shaq turned to Keller, his gaze unreadable. "You thought you could play God in here," he said, his voice steady. "Decide who gets to walk through and who doesn't, who deserves to be treated with respect and who doesn't." Keller had nothing to say. Shaq took a step closer, not threatening, just towering. "But you forgot one thing." Keller's breath hitched. Shaq's voice dropped to a lethal calm. "You were standing in my house." Langley visibly winced. Victoria, still standing nearby, quietly filming everything, let out the faintest smile. Davenport turned back to Reynolds. "What happens next is your call, Director." Reynolds nodded, then faced Keller. "You're done," he said simply. Keller's stomach plummeted. "Wait." Reynolds motioned to the two security officers who had initially approached Shaq. "Escort Agent Keller to processing. His badge is revoked as of this moment." The guards hesitated, then stepped forward, the same way they had moved toward Shaq minutes earlier. Only now, the roles had reversed. Keller's voice cracked. This is ridiculous." He looked to Langley, his last hope. "You can't let them do this." But Langley wasn't looking at him. Langley was staring at Shaq, because Shaq hadn't spoken his final words yet. The consequences. Shaq studied Langley for a long, tense moment. Then, he exhaled and looked at Davenport. "I want him gone too." Langley's entire body stiffened. Davenport nodded without hesitation. "I'll have his resignation papers by morning." Langley's lips parted. "Sir, please, Shaq turned away, because he was done listening. Keller was hauled away. Langley's career was over. And Shaq. He stepped toward the boarding gate, finally walking through, untouched. The airport staff stood straighter. The VIP passengers watched with quiet reverence. And Victoria? She recorded every step. Because tomorrow, the world would know exactly what happened at JFK. Shaq paused at the entrance to his jet, looking back one last time. Then, in a single quiet move, he stepped inside. The doors closed, and the sky was his again. The air in the terminal felt suffocating. Keller stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his confidence shattered. The entire airport staff was watching. Passengers still had their phones recording. There was no easy way out. Shaq, however, was calm as ever. He studied Keller for a moment, then tilted his head slightly. "I'm going to give you a choice," Shaq said, his voice even, deliberate. Keller swallowed. "A choice? You can own up to what you did right here, right now," Shaq continued. "Or you can let the world find out the hard way." The words hung in the air. Passengers exchanged glances. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Keller wasn't the one giving orders anymore. Keller's jaw tightened. "I don't..." Shaq held up a hand, stopping him. "Take a second. Think carefully." For the first time, Keller hesitated. His career was already dangling by a thread. If he admitted he had targeted Shaq, he'd be finished. But if he refused, social media would handle the rest. The world had already seen enough. Keller's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, barely audible. Shaq let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "That's the best you got?" Keller's eyes darted around, searching for support. Langley, the airport manager, looked away. Davenport, the CEO of Eversky Airlines, stood stone-faced. The passengers, waiting for a spectacle. Nobody was coming to Keller's rescue. A long pause. Then, Keller made his choice. He turned away. Didn't apologize, didn't admit a thing. Just walked off, rigid, stiff, refusing to acknowledge the damage he had done. Shaq watched him go, his expression unreadable. "All right," Shaq murmured. "Have it your way." And then, he made a simple phone call. The supervisor arrives. The final blow. Shaq didn't have to wait long. Moments later, another man stormed into the terminal. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an official TSA district supervisor's badge. His expression was thunderous. "Agent Keller." Keller froze mid-step. His shoulders stiffened. His face went pale. Slowly, he turned around. The supervisor's jaw was clenched. "Explain to me why I'm getting calls about a TSA agent making a scene at a private terminal." Keller opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Shaq watched, waiting. The supervisor's voice dropped into a dangerous calm. "You had one job," he said. "Screen passengers, ensure safety, follow protocol." A pause. "What you do not do is make up rules on the spot and target VIPs because of your own personal biases." Keller flinched. Shaq noticed how small he looked now, how his arrogance had faded completely. "I want your badge and your gun," the supervisor said, his tone final. Keller's breath hitched. "Sir, You're suspended until further notice." The entire room held its breath. Keller stood frozen for a beat, then reluctantly reached for his badge. The clink of metal on the counter felt like a funeral bell. Shaq exhaled softly. Not in satisfaction, not in victory, just finality. Langley, the airport manager, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Let's all just move forward from this." Shaq glanced at him. "Move forward?" Langley gave a tight smile. "No need to drag this out any further." Shaq chuckled. "That's convenient." Langley's smile faltered. Shaq shook his head and turned toward Davenport, the Eversky CEO. "You should know," Shaq said, casually adjusting his cufflinks. "This isn't the first time I've had problems at this airport." Davenport's expression darkened. "It won't happen again." Shaq smiled slightly. "No, it won't." A beat of silence. And then, finally, Shaq turned toward the boarding gate. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Lawson," Langley said, forcing politeness. Shaq didn't even glance back. Instead, he just walked away. The moment Shaq stepped onto his jet, the tension dissolved. The cabin was a different world. Soft leather seats, a fully stocked bar, a quiet hum of luxury and control. Shaq sank into his seat, finally allowing himself a deep breath. But the lesson, it wasn't over. Because as the jet climbed into the sky, Victoria Hayes, the journalist who had helped expose everything, took a seat across from him. She set her phone down. The recording was still running. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Still working?" Victoria smirked. "Always." A pause. Then she leaned forward slightly. "So," she said. "What now?" Shaq exhaled, looked out the window, watching the clouds roll past. Then he turned back toward her. "Now?" He tilted his head. "Now we see if Keller learned anything." Victoria leaned back, intrigued. "You think he'll change?" Shaq considered that for a moment. Then he simply said, "He'll have to." The camera kept rolling, and the world was about to watch. The private jet cruised at 30,000 feet, cutting through the night sky with effortless precision. The world below was nothing more than a sea of darkness, broken only by faint city lights twinkling like distant stars. Inside, the cabin was silent, except for the soft hum of the engines. Shaq sat by the window, one hand resting on the armrest, his eyes fixed on the sky. Across from him, Victoria Hayes studied him carefully. The journalist had spent years interviewing powerful men, dissecting their motivations, uncovering their secrets. But Shaq? He was different. She leaned forward, breaking the silence. "All right, tell me. What now?" Shaq didn't respond immediately. Victoria pressed on. "Do you want revenge or change?" Shaq exhaled slowly, as if weighing the question in his mind. Then, he turned toward her, a small, knowing smile forming. "You already know the answer." Victoria tilted her head. "Do I?" Shaq leaned back, eyes flickering toward the phone resting on the table between them. Because while they sat here, in the sky, the world below was catching fire. Victoria's phone vibrated, again and again. She picked it up, scanning the notifications. Hundreds of messages, news alerts flooding in, social media blowing up. The video, the one she had recorded, had gone viral. Millions of views in less than an hour. Headlines were everywhere. TSA agent humiliates airline owner, but instantly regrets it. Racial profiling or power trip? The internet reacts to JFK incident. Shaquille, Big Shaq, stopped from boarding his own jet. Here's what happened next. Victoria scrolled through the comments. Unbelievable. This is why people don't trust authority. Damn, Shaq handled that with class. Where's that TSA guy now? Bet he's regretting everything. She glanced up at Shaq. You've won. Shaq didn't react. She raised an eyebrow. You don't look happy. He finally spoke, his tone even. This isn't about winning. Victoria crossed her arms. Isn't it? The guy who tried to flex his power over you just lost everything. People like him, guys who throw their weight around because they think they can. They don't deserve second chances. Shaq tapped his fingers against the armrest. Maybe. Victoria studied him. You don't sound convinced. Shaq picked up his phone. And then, he did something unexpected. He dialed a number. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Who are you calling? Shaq simply said, Keller. Her entire body stiffened. Wait, what? Shaq didn't answer. The line rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then, it connected. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper. Hello? Shaq didn't respond immediately. He could hear it in Keller's tone, the exhaustion, the weight of everything crashing down. Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady, controlled. Brad. Silence. Then, Keller exhaled, almost like a bitter laugh. So you called to rub it in? Shaq ignored the jab. Where are you? A pause. Then, the sound of a TV in the background. Some motel, Keller muttered. Didn't have much of a choice after your little show back there. Shaq's grip tightened slightly on the phone. My little show? Keller sighed, voice laced with frustration. Come on, man. You know how this works. Public sees a clip, they go crazy. Doesn't matter what I say now. I'm done. Shaq glanced at Victoria, who was listening intently. You did this to yourself. Shaq said evenly. Keller scoffed. Yeah? And what do you want me to say? That I screwed up? That I got caught up in my own bullshit? His voice cracked slightly. Well, guess what? I know that. Shaq remained silent. Keller let out a bitter chuckle. You think I don't see it? My face is everywhere. My badge is gone. My career is over. For the first time, Keller sounded human. Not arrogant, not defensive. Just lost. Shaq's voice softened just a fraction. So what now? Keller hesitated. What do you mean? Shaq leaned forward slightly. You said it yourself. Your career is over. So what are you going to do about it? Another long pause. Keller's voice dropped. What choice do I have? Shaq exhaled, his tone firm but measured. You've got one shot at redemption. Keller said nothing. Victoria, still watching, looked almost shocked. You want me to fix this? Keller asked after a beat. Shaq's response was instant. Number, I want you to own it. Keller let out a breath. And if I don't? Shaq's answer was simple. Then this moment right here? It defines you forever. The words hit hard. Shaq could hear it. The hesitation. The internal battle Keller was fighting. For a man who had always held control, this was the first time he had none. A long silence followed. Then, finally, Keller spoke. What do I have to do? Victoria was stunned. She had expected anger, a lecture, a complete takedown. But Shaq? He had given Keller a choice. She leaned forward. What are you thinking? Shaq set his phone down, staring at the screen for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he simply said, We'll see what kind of man he really is. Victoria exhaled. And if he does nothing? Shaq finally met her gaze. Then he gets exactly what he deserves. Victoria studied him, then slowly nodded. You're different, Shaq. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, I hear that a lot. Victoria smirked. No, I mean it. Most people would have just buried him. Shaq exhaled. I don't need revenge. A pause. I need accountability. The jet continued soaring. Far below, the world was still talking. And somewhere in a dimly lit motel room, Keller sat alone, staring at his own reflection, realizing that his future now rested in his own hands. Redemption or ruin. The choice was his. The private jet touched down smoothly on the tarmac, its wheels kissing the runway with effortless grace. The moment should have been routine, just another landing for one of the most powerful men in aviation. But this was different. Shaq could feel it, the weight of what waited outside. The moment the aircraft slowed, his phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages, missed calls, media alerts. The world had seen everything. And now, they wanted to hear from him. Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing across the cabin. Victoria Hayes was already checking her phone, scrolling through endless headlines. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "You ready for this?" she asked. Shaq smirked slightly. "Not really." Victoria chuckled. "Liar." Shaq just shook his head, then turned toward the window. Outside, the crowd was waiting. The moment the jet doors opened, the world erupted. A sea of cameras flashed, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. The press was there in full force, major networks, independent journalists, social media influencers. But it wasn't just the media. Among the crowd stood politicians, civil rights leaders, corporate executives. This wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was a movement. Shaq descended the stairs, composed as ever. He wasn't just stepping onto the runway, he was stepping into history. Victoria followed closely behind, her journalist instincts on high alert. She could see it in the eyes of the crowd. This wasn't just news, it was a reckoning. A reporter shoved a mic forward. "Mr. Lawson, do you believe this was a case of racial profiling?" Another voice. "Do you plan to press charges against the TSA? Is this proof that discrimination still exists in America's airports?" Shaq held up a hand, and miraculously, the noise died down. He could have said anything. He could have fueled anger, outrage, division. But instead, he spoke with measured power. "I know what you all want me to say," he began. His voice was calm but firm, each word carrying weight. "You want me to call this a fight. You want me to stand here and tell you that today was about one bad TSA agent abusing his power." A beat of silence. "But if that's all you take away from this, then we've missed the real issue." The crowd leaned in. "This isn't about one man. It's about a system that lets things like this happen. A system that allows bias, conscious or unconscious, to decide who gets respect and who doesn't." A murmur spread through the audience. Shaq's eyes swept the crowd. "We can fire one agent. We can force one airport to change its policies. But if we don't address the bigger problem, what's stopping this from happening again? Next week? Next month? To someone who doesn't have the resources to fight back?" The silence was deafening. Then, from the back of the crowd, a figure stepped forward, and suddenly, the energy shifted. The crowd parted slightly, murmurs rippling as Brad Keller appeared. Dressed in a simple gray suit, his tie slightly loosened, his face drained of all the arrogance he once carried. He wasn't the man who had stood tall at the security checkpoint. He looked smaller. Keller hesitated, glancing around at the faces locked onto him. He had spent years commanding authority, but now, standing here, he had none. A few reporters recognized him immediately. "Agent Keller, do you have a response to the backlash? Do you think you were treated unfairly? Are you here to apologize?" Keller swallowed hard. Then, he looked at Shaq. For a moment, nothing happened. Shaq simply watched him, his expression unreadable. Keller took a breath, then finally spoke. He hesitated, gathering himself. Then, his voice steadier. "I got it wrong." A hush fell over the press. "I let my own bias cloud my judgment," Keller admitted. "I was so focused on proving I had power that I forgot what my job was actually about." His throat tightened. "I made a mistake, and I own that." A camera flashed. Someone whispered, "Damn." Keller turned fully toward Shaq now. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this. Not because it fixes anything, but because it's the truth." The moment stretched. All eyes were on Shaq. Would he accept the apology, reject it, ignore it? Shaq studied Keller carefully. Then, he did something no one expected. He stepped forward and extended his hand. The crowd gasped. Keller stared at it, shocked. He hesitated, then slowly reached out. Their hands met in a firm, brief shake. Then Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Keller could hear. "Don't waste this moment," Shaq said. "You've got one shot to make it count." Keller nodded, his grip tightening. "I won't." As Shaq pulled back, he turned to the reporters one last time. And then, in a voice that carried across the entire airfield, he delivered the words that would be replayed in newsrooms for weeks to come. "Real power isn't about who you can control, it's about who you choose to lift up." Silence. Then, applause. Not polite, not obligatory, but real, genuine, powerful. And as Shaq finally turned toward his awaiting car, the world knew. This wasn't just a news story. This was a shift in history. The story doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. What happens when power is challenged? When the truth comes to light? When the system is forced to change? If you love high-stakes drama, gripping power struggles, and stories that make you think long after they end, you're in the right place. Follow us for more intense, thought-provoking stories that expose hidden truths, challenge injustice, and keep you on the edge of your seat. Share your thoughts. Was Keller's downfall deserved? Could he truly redeem himself? Let us know in the comments.